So in this lesson, what we want to talk about are the gains from trade and specialization. So just to do sort of a quick review from last time, where we talked about comparative and absolute advantages, let's do another problem real quick, which we'll be coming back to later on today. So we've got two people, Pat and Devin, and let's say they can grow apples or oranges. And so these people, they face a trade-off between apples and oranges. Pat can grow 400 apples or 200 oranges, and Devin can grow 100 apples or 1,000 oranges. And so here, right, we can use our really quick trick. We see that Pat has an absolute advantage in apples, right, because he can grow more apples than Devin. And Devin has an absolute advantage in oranges because he can grow more oranges than Pat. And so they have differing absolute advantages. And so they also have the same comparative advantages, right? Pat has a comparative advantage in apples. Devin has a comparative advantage in oranges. But let's go through just real quick, just for some review. So for Pat, one apple costs some number of oranges, and one orange costs some number of apples. And for Devin, one apple costs some number of oranges, and one orange costs some number of apples. Okay, so pause the video here and fill in those numbers, and I'll give you the answer in a few seconds. Okay, so for Pat, one apple, so we have to divide by 400, costs him half an orange, and we can just take the reciprocal and get 2. Right? For Devin, one apple, so I divide by 100, costs 10 oranges, and so one orange costs 1/10, right? And so there you are, just a real quick review of comparative and absolute advantage, okay? Now, we're going to talk about trade today, so I'm going to flip this over, but we'll come back to those in a little bit. So first off, let's talk about what trade is. When I say trade, what am I actually talking about? So what is trade? Well, basically, trade is an exchange or transfer of property rights or use rights. Okay? So when we trade things, we're actually giving up certain rights to use that thing. We're not necessarily trading physical objects. We're trading the rights to use those objects. For example, when I go buy a cup of coffee, I trade Starbucks the right to use the dollar bills in my hand for the right to consume the coffee, right? I don't get all the rights of the coffee though, right? But I get most of them. I get the right to dump the coffee down the drain. I get the right to throw the coffee away if I don't like it. I get the right to drink it all. I get all kinds of rights, but I don't get all of them. For example, when I buy the coffee, I don't get the right to throw the coffee at someone's face, or to freeze it and throw it through a window, or do anything destructive with it, right? So I have lots of rights when it comes to coffee, but I don't have all of the rights, okay? And so why do people trade with one another? So why bother? Right, so why do we trade? Right? Why do you give up $1 or $2.30 some odd cents to go get a coffee from Starbucks? right? Well, it must be the case that you prefer to have the coffee more than you prefer to have the dollars, right? You would rather have the coffee than the dollars, okay? And so for you, you prefer, for example, coffee to dollars. In other words, you'd rather have the coffee than have the dollars. And so you walk into the Starbucks and you say, hey, I have these dollars that I would like to turn into coffee, right? Or I would like to trade you for your coffee. So why does Starbucks accept your trade? Right? If for you the coffee is more valuable than the dollars, why would Starbucks ever trade you? Well, for them, it must be the case that they prefer the coffee to, they prefer the dollars to the coffee. Right? And so essentially what happens is you walk into Starbucks and say to the barista, I have these dollars and I would much rather have coffee. And they say, holy crap, we have coffee here and we would rather have your dollars. Why don't we trade? And so you trade and both of you are made better off. And so what we say is that trade is, by definition, mutually beneficial, right? You get the coffee, which you value more than the dollars that you gave up, and they get the dollars, which they value more than the coffee they gave up, right? And so as a result, when you buy the coffee, you typically say, thank you. Right? And the reason why you thank them is because you appreciate what they just did for you. They produced coffee and gave it to you, which makes you happy. And at the same time, Starbucks will typically respond with, thank you. Right? And why they say thank you is because you gave them dollars, which they would rather have than the coffee. And so they are saying that they appreciate you coming in and making that trade because they are also better off. And so this leads to what we call the double thank you. Right? Where both parties are made better off, and as a result, both of them say thank you. Right? So in this sense, what we can actually say is that trade creates wealth. Right? It actually creates the wealth. It creates new wealth that didn't exist beforehand. Now, where did that wealth come from? Did you take it from Starbucks, or did they take it from you? Right? Of course not. The wealth, rather, must have been produced just simply by switching who owns what. So this trade produces the wealth. And so we could say that trade is therefore productive. Right? But one question that we might want to ask is trade efficient? Right? So is trade efficient? Right? But let's do this. What does it mean to be efficient? Right? So what is efficiency? So one way to think about efficiency is to talk about, say, cars. So let's say we have two cars. We have car A, which gets 25 miles per gallon, and we have car B, which gets 75 miles per gallon. Okay? So if I were to ask you, which car A or car B, is more efficient, what would you say? So if you answered that question, no matter how you answered it, you're only half right. Okay? And the answer, or the reason why you're only half right, is because we haven't talked about cost. So what if the first car only cost $1, but the second car cost, let's say, $1 billion? Right? Then what would you say? Which car is more efficient? Right? And so what this is getting at is a difference between what economists call technical efficiency which is a comparison between inputs and outputs, and economic efficiency. Right? And economic efficiency is asking the question, is the additional technical efficiency worth the difference in cost? Right? Or more succinctly, economic efficiency asks the question, is it worth it? All right, so the car A is less technically efficient than car B, right? Because if you put a gallon of gas into each one of these, an input, you will get more miles, an output, from car B than you will from car A. But it might be the case that car A is more economically efficient than car B because it only costs $1, whereas car B costs $1 billion, right? So you might say, if your value for not putting CO2 gas out in the atmosphere is sufficiently low, right, you would say that yes, car B gets better fuel economy, and yes, it puts less carbon dioxide in the air, but that's not a big deal to me, and so I am going to go with car A because it's more economically efficient, right? But if you are, say, Al Gore, or you have more money than God, and you value the planet very highly, right, you might say, well, car B is the most efficient thing because it gets 75 miles to the gallon, it gets 3 times the mileage, and it's absolutely worth it to me to pay this difference in cost to save the planet, right? And so economic efficiency might be a personal concept. Technical efficiency is a data-driven, right? 75 versus 25. Okay, so let's combine this with comparative advantage, right? What we were talking about earlier. So let's go back to Pat and Devin. Okay, so with Pat and Devin, right, as you can see, for every orange that Pat produces, he has to give up 2 apples. And for Devin, every apple costs him $10. And so alone, if we were to graph these, we could say that we've got Pat and apples and oranges. And we've got, let's say, Devin, apples and oranges, right? If we were to graph these, we could say that for Pat, he's got 400 apples or 200 oranges. Misread my own chart. Okay. And for Devin, he's got 100 apples or 1,000 oranges. And so we'll draw that line real quick. I'll use a straight edge since it's a little long. that. You can see my to-do sheet for the other day. There we are. Okay. And so there. So we've got our two graphs, or two lines, right, which show all the production possibilities. In fact, we call these production possibilities frontiers, but we'll talk more about those next week when we do supply. Okay? But you can see that Devin faces a trade-off between apples and oranges, and so too does Pat. Okay? And so anywhere along these lines, Pat and Devin can produce, right? They can produce here, Pat can produce here, all right? Devin can produce there, or here, right? Or here, or here, right? And so on and so forth. They can't produce anywhere beyond those lines. So they can't produce out, let's say, here, right? But what I want to convince you of right now is that if we could get Pat or Devin or both of them beyond their curve, so if they could consume something like this point or this point, right, that would make them better off. So if they can consume beyond their PPF curves, right, if they can produce or if they can consume more than they could produce on their own, then that should be a good thing. We should give it 2 thumbs up, right, which is hard to do if you're facing down. So thumbs up, right? 2 thumbs up if we can accomplish that. Okay, and so let's see if we can figure out some way. Okay, so let's suppose that Devin walks up to Pat and says, "Hey Pat, I have this great idea. Why don't you grow all grow all apples? I'll grow only oranges, and then we'll trade with one another. I'll trade you some of my oranges for some of your apples." Okay, and so let's say that Pat proposes the following price, or Devin proposes that he gets 1 apple for every 5 oranges. Okay, so Devin walks up to Pat and says, "I will give you 5 oranges for 1 apple." Okay, so let's think about whether or not that would benefit anyone. So let's think about Devin's case. So in Devin's case, for him to get an apple on his own, he has to give up 10 oranges, right? But here, he only has to give up 5 to get an orange, right? So does Devin benefit? Yes, right? Devin wins because Devin gets to have apples without giving up as many oranges as he would on his own, right? And so for every apple that Devin consumes, he would actually be plus 5 oranges relative to where he would have been. So we can move Devin along a curve like this, and that will actually enable him to get beyond his PPF curve. So Devin wins, right? We've done Devin, but what about Pat? Does Pat win? So for Pat used to grow only apples, right? And to get an orange, he would have to give up 2 whole apples. But now, when he gives up just 1 apple, he gets 5 oranges, right? Or for every 2 apples that he would give up, he gets 10 oranges. So he used to give up 2 apples to get 1, and now if he gives up 2, he gets 10. And so Pat definitely wins as well, and so Pat gets to consume along a curve out there as well. And so what we have is a situation where both Pat and Devin can specialize in what they're producing and consume more of both apples and oranges than they could by themselves, which is a truly remarkable and amazing thing if you think about it, right? By sheerly specializing in the thing that they have a comparative advantage in and trading with one another, everyone gets to have more. So if you've heard that phrase, team, or that acronym TEAM, right, which is, of course, together everyone achieves more, right? If you've heard that phrase before, economics is actually the science of team. If we all work together and specialize in the things that we're good at and trade with one another, then everyone will achieve more, right? Which is an amazing discovery. So the sheer fact that people specialize and trade allows everyone on the planet to have more things, right? And if you think about it in the context of your lives, you should be it should be fairly intuitive that this is true. Imagine how many shirts would be in your closet if you had to make them all yourself, right? Imagine how many shoes you would own if you had to make your own shoes. Imagine how many cell phones you would have if you had to make your own cell phone, right? And so we see this every day all around the world in our own lives, and at some level this is just describing things that we already know. And so at some level, economics is just the science of the obvious, if you really think about it, right? This is just saying you should do the things that you're good at and trade for things that you are not quite as good at as someone else, right? And so the basic idea here is that trade is made of nothing but winning, right? Pat wins, Devin wins, everybody wins by trade.